Today, I wanted us to read this article, which comes to us from almost 60 years ago. This article, Shakespeare in the Bush, I think may be the second most widely read thing that an anthropologist has ever produced. I think it's second only to the body ritual among the Naki-Rama. And one of the things I'm trying out in this class of cultural anthropology, the 200 level class, is doing something a little different than I've done in the past. Just give you some of these, what you might call classic articles to read that really, if you're an anthropology minor or major, you probably want to be familiar with in your life. Now, in the olden days, I assigned this article to my intro to anthropology class. I'm not doing it in intro anymore because I figure, the intro people, they need to learn just like the general stuff. But you here in this 200 level class, you might be more interested in anthropology. And by the time you get to the 300 level classes, then you'll at least know what we're talking about when we say Shakespeare in the Bush. That said, I've assigned this article quite a few times in my life, maybe 20 times. So for me, it gets a little bit, I'm trying to figure out ways to make it fresh because it's been so read and so commented on. So how do we say anything new about it? So I asked you in this class to try and diagnose why people keep assigning it and why it continues to be popular, and also give you a critique of it from one might call a more advanced anthropological perspective, more in the present. Have you had to read this already in high school? Hamlet. Only a few. Yeah, that's another thing. When in the previous incarnation of American high schools in the US, almost everybody had to read Hamlet in senior year. And so you went from reading Hamlet senior year of high school, and then you take a intro to anthropology class as a first year student, and then you could read this, and it was very close to it. This article is so popular that it's actually been translated into other languages like Spanish. So maybe there is something about Shakespeare and literature that happens. It's by Bohannan. One thing that I always find odd, and I'd like you to explain this to me, is this happens a lot, and it happened in this class when I assigned this article. I get all these guy pronouns, all these he's in there, like he was telling the story, he was doing this. Very Laura Bohannan here. Very much a woman telling the story. Why do we think it's a guy? That's what I think sometimes. Sometimes people assume that the guys are the ones drinking beer out there with the guys. All that beer drinking. Yeah, and there she was off in Africa. Yeah. Maybe that might have something to do with it, the year, and so you assume it's a guy. I guess in anthropology, we should tiny bit pat ourselves on the back that anthropologists were doing this a lot longer than other disciplines. Margaret Mead's book about coming of age in Samoa was published in 1928. So Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, published in 1934. Perhaps in some ways, became a guy-dominated discipline in some respects, but the people who were most popular, the most widely read anthropologists were Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and in this case, Laura Bohannan. So I guess said, I'll give us a tiny bit of a pat on the back for doing that earlier than most people were. All right, so Bohannan starts off this journey believing something about Shakespeare. What does she think is going to happen? Or what does she think Shakespeare is like when she's going to tell this story? What does she believe about Shakespeare, the author? She hasn't even gone to the field yet. She's talking with her English colleague over there in England. Bohannan is an American. And she's stopped over in England for a while, and she's having an argument or a fight with somebody before she even goes to Africa, before she even goes to the Tiv. What does she think about Hamlet and Shakespeare. The meanings are universal. So Bohannon's first belief is that Shakespeare is like Shakespeare. It's big, it's universal. It's going to mean the same thing everywhere. You might have to make some word changes here and there, but the meaning is going to be the same all over the world. And she says something that's interesting for an anthropologist to say. Human nature is pretty much the same the whole world over. So what she's saying is, yeah, people dress differently, have different little customs and stuff, but they're going to understand this because people are basically the same. Human nature is pretty much the same. And you have this universal poet, Shakespeare, who is going to be able to explain it to you. Now, I would say that this is a very American in the sense of a United States kind of attitude toward Shakespeare. We like to teach Shakespeare as if it's the greatest universal work of all time. Everybody knows Shakespeare and is supposed to speak to these universal themes. What does her English colleague say about this idea? What's his argument back to her before she even goes away? What does he say about this idea? He says something that's interesting here. So the person who is English, remember, Bohannon's an American US person, and her person who lives in England, her colleague there, says Shakespeare was a very English poet, and one can easily misinterpret the universal by misunderstanding the particular. And so, but again, I just want to emphasize this before she ever goes to talk to try and explain Shakespeare to a different society. We have somebody who's basically saying, you know what, you Americans really don't get Shakespeare because you think it's a universal thing, but in fact, you really have to understand the particularities of English culture at the time to be able to understand Shakespeare. And you're not going to be able to just explain it or be able to draw out these universal themes. But she gets to the field and does some of her field work, but pretty soon there's not much to do, and they see her reading this book. And so they say, tell us about it. And she gets to try this out, try out her hypothesis. Is it going to be a universal human nature is everywhere the same? Or was her English colleague right about this? So she opens up with that ghost, trying to tell them about the ghost. She gets stuck. When you open up Hamlet, it starts with this ghost thing. And in this village, and she does specify that there are other places around there where they might have an idea or a concept of ghosts, but where she is, they do not believe that an individual can come back as a personality after death. Something else happens, but you don't come back as an individual personality. So they're like, no, must be witchcraft, must be a zombie, must be something. There's no way there's a ghost. And I want to point out here that this is not simply lacking the word for ghost. It's about having a whole concept or an idea. And it's not about necessarily a belief. For example, I'm not a big believer in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. However, I do have a concept of a ghost. So if somebody tells me they saw a ghost, I'll be like, yeah, I know what that is. But in this case, it is outside of the language and outside of the conceptual world. Now, it doesn't mean it's like because they don't have that complexity. It means they might have different ideas about what happens after death. Now, the other thing that Hamlet is very upset about, Hamlet the son, is that his mom gets too quickly married after his dad dies. I'm not going to say that this never happens in our society, but they are actually very into this idea. They're like, yeah, if your husband dies, you should marry the brother. And in fact, he did well. That was the right thing to do. Now, actually, maybe our Bible reading has fallen down a little bit in our society, but when Jesus was talking with people of his time. They tried to trap him and they told him a story about the woman who got married to a brother and then a brother and then a brother and a brother, and they all died, the seven brothers. And then they ask him, which one of these brothers will she be married to in heaven? Now, tell you how Jesus got out of the trap in a second. But I just want to point out that this is kind of in our tradition. It's called the leveret. And so you would keep the inheritance in the family. And so that would be a good thing to do, to keep it in the line of the brothers. And so in this biblical culture, remember what Jesus said? Our Bible reading is way down. He said, in heaven, they are neither taken nor given in marriage. So you're not going to be married in heaven. You're going to be, don't have to worry about that one. If you can make it to heaven, you don't have to be taken or given in marriage, at least according to Jesus. All right, so again, but in this society, they would have practiced this, and that would have been a good idea. Hamlet in his society is like, no, this is terrible. In part because, of course, the being a king meant you should be monogamous. You should have one wife. Whereas what would they say about being a king? Hey, you need a bunch of wives. I mean, the best thing you could do if you're the king or the chief is have a bunch of wives around to do the work and then have more people to do more work for you. That's how you know you're a king or a chief. What are you talking about? Being married to one person. So yeah, that's interesting. And then the central dilemma of Hamlet is how Hamlet wants to know is if and how he should avenge his father's death. Why, that's one of the reasons he goes on his famous scene, which even if you haven't read it, you probably know the whole line about to be or not to be. And he's trying to figure out if he should go in and avenge his father's death. What would they say about this, going in and avenging your dad's death? Should you do that? No. Why? Who should do that? Same generation. Yeah, his friend group. Absolutely. So, in their world, Hamlet would have never been like a story at all. Like, there's no reason for this to have happened, because if there's been a wrong done, the son is not avenging the father. That's absurd. It's the people in the peer group, the age mates. Those are the people who should get together and decide what's going on. So the whole point of Hamlet is up for grabs here. So some of you said that your favorite part was just frustration as she goes along, realizing this is not going very well. So their interpretations, they get upset about this too, or something like that. They're like, hey, quiet for a second. And they say something that's really interesting. They say, we believe you when you say your marriage customs are different or your clothes and weapons, but people are the same everywhere. Notice. That's what she said at the beginning, and now they're basically saying it back to her, but because they think that their way of doing things is the right way. We believe you when you say people are different like that, but no, our customs are different. People are the same everywhere. Sometime you must tell us some more stories of your country. What are they going to tell her? Why do they want her to tell them more stories? Yeah. We, who are the elders, will instruct you in their true meaning, and then you can go back to your society and tell them how much you learned from us. So it's just like she goes off thinking that she's going to give us this universal meaning, and they topsy-turvy twist things around. So for Bohannan, I think this story shows, or the reason that many of you said it was relevant, is that it was a much deeper cultural difference than what she was expecting. You said in this story, we could see cultural difference without having to know much about the culture. What do you mean by that? You agreed. Cultural relativism without having to have much background. I agree with you that in some ways, it's like a quick way to show like big cultural difference without having to read a whole book about it, or you don't have to do too much and you can grasp what's going on here. And it does show us something that was really a theme in Bohannan's work and some of her other writings, which is that there's a lot of people who want to adopt what she would call maybe an easy cultural relativism. Like, oh, they wear red hats, we wear blue hats, they eat this, we eat that, anything goes. And for Bohannan, she really tried to explore, like, well, what happens if people are doing something that is against your principles? Like, how do you deal with that if we're talking about ideas, how you treat sick people, for example? She, in another work, talked about how people were treating a blind person. And so she's not trying to say that cultural relativism is an excuse. And I've said that it doesn't mean the same thing as moral or philosophical relativism, but sometimes it's difficult. It's more difficult to do that than we think until you are confronted with that possibility. Also, of course, I think that they also believe in this humans are the same everywhere. They believe that the universality, or Bohannan is trying to tell us that there's like this pretty deep difference, which is messing up her view of what human nature is and how literature should be interpreted. And they don't believe that deep difference. They believe that humans are the same everywhere or all around the world. Now, we're going in, there's also some lessons here in language and what we're going into the next chapter. Guest will talk about this story a little bit, but one of the things that Bohannan was really good at is trying to think about the meanings of words and concepts, and that words simply couldn't be necessarily translated from one language to another, that there are all kinds of conceptual ideas going on. So we talked about the idea of a ghost, how that's not simply a word translation, it's a conceptual issue. The idea about what water is, their idea is that one can drown because of water, because water is always good, and so it had to have been witchcraft that did it, or the idea of madness. So in some ways, a person couldn't just be crazy. There had to be some cause. We'll talk about this more when we talk about different ideas about religion and causality and how people need to have a why for things. But that's something we'll be, again, talking about in the next class on language. Now, there are several levels of interpretation of this. So Bohannan, for the most part, wants to tell us about deep differences, cultural differences, and cultural relativism. But there's different ways to read this. You said that it actually proved that people are the same all over the world. Why? You haven't met a person who hasn't done that. I think that stories, interpreting stories, engaging with each other over food and sometimes other beverages and substances is pretty widely shared among human beings. We are storytelling people. And they were all super engaged and asking questions and wanting to know about this. And so one of the things that we could say that it shows is that humans are always trying to make meaning of their world. We are trying to understand our world in a symbolic way and to make meaning about it. It also seems to, in some ways, like Bohannan starts off with a kind of ethnocentric perspective. My interpretation is going to be universal. I know how to interpret Shakespeare, but we could say here that in some ways, they also believe that their way of reading Shakespeare is the correct way, or the correct way to interpret it. We could also note here that perhaps in all societies, there's a sense of right and wrong, good and bad, what you should do and you should not do. However, when you say that, you immediately have to qualify it that the things that are one person says are bad to do, don't marry that guy, or in another society, the very thing you should be doing. Yeah, go marry that person, quick. So we all perhaps have ideas about right and wrong, but they can be quite different from society to society. So in this for the first time, I decided to give you some words from Yarimar Bonilla from a few years ago, her book called Non-Sovereign Futures, in which she is trying to really engage on a different level with the people she's talking to. And she says that anthropologists shouldn't just talk to people and get knowledge from them, that they should sit down and really think with them. And so what I think she's saying here is that in Bohannan's work, she's not really taking their interpretation of this work seriously, right? She's talking to them, and sure, she's taking them seriously and struggling to interpret this. And then at the end, it's a little bit complicated, her critique, but I think what Bonilla is saying is that the ideas that the TIV have get brought to a whole different audience to be evidence for some debate that they have nothing to do with. So instead of being able to bring us wisdom, instead of being able to participate in the debate, they've been read about for 50 or 60 years, but they haven't really entered the debate. They've simply been kind of bit players, you might say. So I was interested in how you thought about this. Some of you seem to mostly agree. So you thought that their views should maybe be taken more into account. I thought you also agreed with the critique. Is that true? Yeah. That Bohannan goes wrong, you said, or is charming but wrong, or something like that. Yeah, no, I agree. Right. It's offensive. I think that Bonilla probably might be able to feel this offensiveness a little bit more than other people, because coming from a coming from Puerto Rico in a society that's often been portrayed as, oh, it's so nice to be there and they're so cute. She might have a similar kind of sensibility there. And yeah, I like this critique a lot. It's an important one to consider. Some of you said that, yeah, the critique's fun, but don't throw it out too fast. You thought it was still worth reading, but right, shoot. Here I have been doing this for 20 years with no informed consent. Shit. Yeah, I mean, that's what Bonilla is saying, right? They're being pulled into a debate that they have no idea what's going on. There were a few of you who kind of disagreed. Things have been getting crazy here, so go for it. Yeah. Microaggressive. Yeah, no, I think that there's something. I have assigned this before to students, and fortunately, it didn't seem to come out in anybody's comments this time, but people have been like, they do think that like the TIV are dumb. Like, that's what they get from it. And then I stopped assigning it for it. That's mean. It's more than microaggressive. It's just aggressive. Right. Right. Now, I'm not sure if this was still, I don't know if this would be true in 1966. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, I think so. And the whole title of it could definitely use some updating, right? It's not the best. So yeah, I was about to argue for Bohannan, but now I'm much more even on the side of Bonilla than when I started this slide. Thanks. I think great points were made.